My bike broke, and I had been searching for a used one for weeks. I checked Craigslist almost every day, but didn't find one that I really liked. One night at 9 p.m., I checked again, and I saw a new post about selling a bike. I clicked on it, and I fell in love with the bike instantly. Even though it was worn out, it was exactly the type of bike I had in mind. I quickly texted the seller, and to my surprise, he texted me back almost instantly. He told me that someone was already interested in it, but if I really want to, we could meet up right then. If not, the person will be coming in the morning to buy it from him. I didn't want anyone else to buy it, so I agreed with him about meeting up. I then went to the address he gave me. When I got there, I didn't see him yet, so I decided to stay in the car for a while. I was parked in front of his house, which just happened to be the last one in the neighborhood. The only way to go back out was to make a U-turn since the road came to a dead end where his house was. Across the street was another house, but this house looked like it had been destroyed by a fire. I could tell that no one was living there currently. I waited about 5 minutes before hearing footsteps approaching my car. I looked up and saw no one, so I thought I was just imagining things. Then I heard footsteps approaching my car. I looked up again, and this time I saw a guy coming up with a bike. He knocked on my window and asked if I was the one who was meeting him about the bike. I told him I was, so I opened the door and conversed with him. I decided to buy the bike from him, so I gave him the money and he took off. It was weird, because I thought he was going to go inside a house near him, but instead he just took a slight jog past the neighbor. When I opened my car to put the bike in, I noticed a particular smell. It smelled like burned flesh. I looked everywhere but didn't see anything. Then, all of a sudden, I just had goosebumps. I looked at the house across the street and started to have this unpleasant feeling of being watched. Then I heard a squishing sound, like the sound of raw flesh moving around. It then stopped, so I picked up the bike, but then I saw that my windshield was covered in something. I put the bike back down and started rubbing my hand across it, and I realized that it was ash. My window was covered in lots of ashes. I started to rub it off with my hands when I heard the squishing sound again. I looked across the street, and I saw a man sitting there, near the burned house, just looking at me. It was such a weird feeling, like the person did not belong to this world. From where I was sitting, it seemed like he was eating because he kept touching his mouth and making the squishing sound. I went back to wiping the ashes off. I took a look at the person again, and I suddenly had the feeling that something was not right about him. I couldn't put my finger on it, so I went back to wiping the ashes. I then looked at him again, and I still felt that something was wrong. It took 3 looks at him to figure out what. Every time I looked at him, he was sitting closer and closer to me. Just to make sure, I looked down real quick and looked back at him, and I could definitely tell that he was getting closer. This time we were so close that I could see his face clearly. What I saw shook me to my core. The lower half of his face was gone, and the reason why he kept touching his mouth was because his tongue kept falling out. He was repeatedly trying to put his tongue back into his face. The squishing sound was from his tongue. I got so scared that I just ditched the bike and got in the car. I then stepped on the gas to get out of there. I took a look back when I was far enough, and I saw the man dragging the bike back to the burned house. When I got home, I texted the guy who sold the bike to me, but he never answered me back. To this day, he still hasn't answered me, and I am still left with so many unanswered questions. I was bored, so I started scrolling through Craigslist to see if there was anything that could catch my eye. I then saw a post selling this laptop for a cheap price. The price was very cheap when you compare it to the specs of the laptop, so I texted the owner. He then texted back an hour later, saying he still had the laptop but wouldn't be available until 10 p.m., the time he would be getting off work. Right now it was only 1 p.m., so he told me if I really wanted it, we could meet up when he got off. At around 10 p.m., he texted me, asking if I was still interested in the laptop. I told him I was, so we set up a meeting. I asked him if it would be possible to do this tomorrow morning, but he told me he would be busy that time too, and the only time he was available was now. I lived with my roommate, but he just happened to be out at a party today. I didn't want to go alone, so I called my roommate. It turned out he was still at the party, so I made up my mind to go alone. The chance of this going wrong was rare, I thought, so I didn't put too much thought into it. When I got to the address, it was a big empty parking lot. It looked like the parking lot of a business that was just across from me, but since it was nighttime, there were only 2 cars there. I saw a car in the corner of the parking lot, and a guy was standing there waving at me. There were a bunch of trees where the parking lot ended. I drove up to him and asked if he was the one with the laptop. He pulled out the laptop and told me to check it over. It was still working. I was about to tell him I wanted to buy it when he told me he wanted to show me something. He then opened up a file on the laptop and gave it back to me. When I looked at the file, it was a picture. I looked at it more closely, and it was a picture of a guy in an empty parking lot, holding a laptop, with a look of fear on his face as he looked towards the camera. It took me a moment to realize that the laptop was the same one I was holding right now. My heart started to race because I could feel something was not right. The guy then slowly pulled a gun from under his shirt. When I saw the gun, I just froze. I knew then that the guy was a thief. He then told me that if I moved, he would shoot me. He took out his phone and took a picture of me holding the laptop. I realized that the picture on the laptop must have been the last victim. After taking the picture, the thief just laughed and said he wanted to show me something else. He grabbed the laptop from me with one hand and clicked on another file. He handed it back to me and told me to look at it. When I looked at it, I almost fainted because it was a picture of the same guy as the last picture, but this time he was being stabbed. There was blood everywhere on the ground. The thief then laughed again and pulled out a knife. He now had a knife on one hand and a gun on the other. He then told me to choose between being killed with a gun or stabbed with a knife. When I heard this, my legs just gave up on me and I stumbled down to the ground. I could hear him laughing. He then threatened to shoot me in the head if I didn't stand up in 5 seconds. When I heard this, suddenly something snapped in me. My vision started to get blurry. Something just took over me. I had a feeling that I would be dead either way, no matter what I chose. I was still clutching the laptop, so when I stood up, just as I was about to become fully erected, I threw the laptop as hard as I could to his face, and then I dove down. I was gambling with my life, but there were no other choices to be made. I heard the sound of the gun going off the moment the laptop hit his face. I then just took off running into the darkness of the tree behind him. I didn't want to attempt to grab the gun because the guy was way more muscular than me, and I knew I had no way of subduing him. I only have about a second to run. Going into my car would also take too long, so I ditched that idea. When I got into the darkness, I just started running straight. There were a couple of times where I bumped hard into the trees, but that did not slow me down at all. I just ran and ran, then, when I saw lights at the end, I just ran towards it. When I came out, I noticed I was near a main road with a couple of cars still driving about. I knew I was safe then. It's been almost 2 years since that happened, but I still have nightmares about it once in a while. I am an online reseller. I buy things for cheap and resell them for a profit. I mostly sell collectible vintage stuff, like old radios and collectible dolls. One day, I was browsing Craigslist to see if there was anything I could buy cheap and resell for a profit, as I always do. I came across this listing, and someone was selling some old vintage American dolls. I opened up another tab on my computer screen and opened up the eBay website to see how much those dolls were selling for. To my surprise, one of the dolls was selling for $500 on eBay, so I know it's a good buy since the seller is only asking $50 for the whole box. I was so excited that I dialed the phone number as soon as possible. It only took one ring for the owner to pick up the phone. The guy sounds like he's in a hurry, so we decide to meet in an old liquor store nearby. On the drive to meet up with the guy, I thought to myself, how lucky am I to find such a good flip and profit. When I finally got there, an old car rolled up and parked next to me. A man in his early 40s came out of the car with torn clothes and a dirty look. He rushed to the rear of his trunk and opened it with a squeaky noise. I got out and said hi, but he just ignored me, didn't even look at me, and said to take a look. So I took the dolls out of the box to inspect their condition, and when I did, I got a strange, creepy feeling as if the doll was peering into my soul. I then grabbed the box and handed the money to the guys. He abruptly shut his trunk and sped out without saying anything, as if he were on the run. I put the box of dolls in my trunk and drove off. On the way home, I heard a very loud thump at the back of my car, as if someone had hit me from behind. I pulled over to the side to see what was there and saw nothing. As I was walking back to my seat, I heard it again. It sounded like it was from the inside of my trunk. I listened carefully and heard a little girl laughing inside. I slowly opened my trunk to see what was inside. There was nothing but a box of dolls. I flipped the box over so I can see all the dolls laid out and realize how lucky to have these dolls to sell. I was about to close the trunk when I suddenly heard a laugh from one of the dolls. I picked up all the dolls and pressed on them to see if they were battery operated, but they were just old vintage plush dolls. I was dumbfounded, scratching my head and wondering why I kept hearing this little girl laugh. Then, to my horror, I see tears falling from one of the dolls. I became alarmed when I noticed that all of the dolls were crying. I fell back and got really scared. There was no car around at this time, so I got up and threw all the dolls out into the street. I jumped back inside my car and sped up. When I got home, I was shaking and had never felt this sick before. The next day, I went to look at the listing for the doll, but it had been deleted. A week later, my friend called the phone number that I had used to buy the doll from the guys, but the number was not in service anymore.